The Marriage Bargain, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by William Dufresne. Chapter 1. Julien Delaurent had lost faith in his plan. He thought the ad he had placed in the L.A. trades, looking for a regal-type actress for an extended gig abroad, would bring out the finest America had to offer. So far, that hadn't happened, at least in Los Angeles. Evident by the young lady who had just left his table in the back corner of Donato's, a high-end bistro on the coast just south of Malibu. The scent of her cheap perfume lingered long after she had gone and snuffed out the more pleasing aroma of the fresh-grilled panini Julien had dined on for lunch. Between her fragrance and her appearance, Vanessa Indigo had failed miserably at meeting Julien's standards. Not that there was anything wrong with her blue-tipped hair and excessive tattoos, but Julien needed a woman with an air of sophistication. His choice had to look and act like she'd been groomed for one thing: to marry into the Delaurent family. In addition to her savoir-faire, it would help if she had fine hips and long legs. He didn't particularly care about the size of her breasts. They could be small, medium, or large. Her mouth was more important. Kissable lips, or the lack thereof, was a deal-breaker. Her hair color wasn't a factor. Neither were her eyes. He just had to look into them and see love. The girl he chose would have to be one hell of an actress if he hoped to convince Papa. Julien was ready to wind up the interviews when a young blonde walked through the entrance. Every physical trait he had deemed important was wrapped in cultured class. She's perfect. She stopped at the hostess, and Julien dared to consider that she might be there for him. He sighed when the girl pointed Ms. Perfect toward Soren, Julien's valet, sitting at the bar patiently waiting to greet the applicants. She was here for him. Thank God. Soren glanced his way, and Julien nodded. He had told Soren no more today, but that was before she had waltzed in. She was the answer to his predicament. Ms. Perfect followed Soren to the table, and Julien stood as she stopped in front of him. Mademoiselle? He pulled a chair out for her. She looked ideal for the part. Hopefully she'd be as refined as she appeared. "My name is Camille Chandler," she said, dropping into the chair and perching her purse onto her lap and a briefcase at her chair's side. "Julien Delaurent." He snuck a peek at her hands, her left hand in particular. No rings. Good. She thumbed through the satchel and offered him a single piece of paper. "Here's a bit of my acting history." A shadow of insecurity darkened her turquoise eyes so briefly he questioned its realism. She settled her gaze on him, and his heart danced with excitement. Julien didn't care about her acting history. He was more interested in whether or not she'd come across as convincing. It was one thing to act like his wife, and completely another to look the part. He took the resume, glanced over the paper, and dropped it onto the table next to his plate. "Are you hungry, Miss Chandler? Can I order you something?" "No, thank you. Nothing to eat, but I wouldn't mind having an iced tea." Her voice lulled him into a relaxed mood. Julien waved at the waiter. "Could you bring the lady an iced tea?" he said, and glanced at Camille. "Sugar or unsweetened?" "Unsweetened," she said, reaching for the sugar substitute. Did women as young and softly rounded as her worry about their figures? He saw nothing wrong with hers. It belonged in a Ferrari. Another waitress passed by with a piece of apple pie. "Ooh, is the apple pie fat-free?" she asked. "No, ma'am, but we do have a nice low-fat custard." "I'll have a piece of the apple pie. And can I get a scoop of vanilla ice cream on the side? She fiddled with a couple of Splenda packets, waiting for the iced tea. Julian tried to figure the odds against her putting the sugar substitute in her drink. The waiter returned and set a glass in front of her. "Your pie will be right out." He paused just a second or two and then moved away from the table. Camille ripped the Splenda packets open and dumped the contents into her tea. "Fascinating. Have you been able to earn a competent living as an actress?" He began fishing for information, just to get a feel for her potential as an actress. She gave an impromptu shrug. "Not as much as I'd like, but I do okay." She paused as the waiter appeared with her ice cream and pie. Once he'd left, she continued on. "I get enough commercials and bit parts to pay the rent," she said with a hint of laughter, and then scooped her ice cream and pie together onto her fork. The most satisfied look crossed her face as the sweet treats mixed together inside her mouth. It wasn't a depraved expression, but said, "I really like this, and I'm not worried about overindulging." She picked up her iced tea and washed the remnants down with her artificially sweetened drink. The whole concept confused Julian. He drew a breath. A sweet, soft scent, one that reminded him of lavender, invaded his senses. It wasn't an overwhelming or an expensive perfume, but it did its job effectively. He summoned the bravado to discuss her odd eating habits. "I've got to ask about your method of sweetening your tea." "Artificial sweeteners melt easier in iced tea," she said. "There's nothing worse than bitter, undersweetened tea." Her features contorted in an expression of distaste. This girl's major complaint was unsweetened iced tea? That suggested an easygoing demeanor. He liked that. He also liked her wholesome good looks. She was dressed simply but smartly in a plain skirted suit of pale blue. Designer labels wouldn't be found on the garment, and it wasn't as chic as a snug custom-made fit, but it was adequate for her station in life. And it complemented, brightened her blue eyes. "So what's your deal?" she asked. "My deal?" "Yeah." Her fingers, tapered and delicate, caressed the glass. "What exactly is this acting gig?" She gave him a scrutinizing look. "I take it you're not a movie producer?" "No, I'm not a producer," he said. "You won't win any Oscars with this role, but it pays well." Her face drew into a terribly serious expression, and she peered at him shrewdly. "Well, if I'm not going to get an Oscar nod, then it'd better pay damn well." She took another bite of her dessert. "The part also requires the actress be single." Her head shot back, and she hit him with a lethal glare. "Not that I see how that matters, but I am not married." "The location is in Europe." Her gaze traveled off to the side. "I've got a passport." "Let's have dinner this evening," he said. "We'll discuss the part in further detail then." He wanted the chance to show her the benefits of the acting assignment, just a taste of what accepting his offer would involve before revealing the particulars. If she saw the luxury in which she'd be living, perhaps it would induce a positive reaction. "Okay, sure. Why not?" she said, after a second of thought. "I'll have a driver come for you at 6, he suggested. "How about if I meet you?" "All right," he agreed, impressed that she was so easily evasive. The trait would come in handy if she accepted his proposal. "Come by the Montage in Beverly Hills." She gave him one of those raised eyebrow looks that wasn't so much about his extravagance as her vigilance. "We'll meet in the lobby." He hoped his calm demeanor was enough to satisfy her concern. Her face relaxed and melted into a smile. "Okay." Julian reached for the pocket inside his blazer and drew out a business card and an ink pen. He jotted down the hotel's name and his room number on the back. "Here's my hotel information. My cell is on the front." He offered her the card. "My room number is on the back." She took it, glanced at it, and slipped it inside her purse. "I don't have a card," she said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. An actress without a business card? Odd. But she was a struggling actress. Perhaps it came down to food or business cards. He could understand why she'd choose the former. "A cell phone, perhaps?" he asked, "in case I need to contact you?" She rattled off a 10-digit number, and he keyed it into his phone. She pushed the empty plate away, sighed, and then smiled. "I've got to go. I have another appointment." She grabbed her purse and briefcase as she stood. Julian rose, out of habit more than anything else. "Well, Camille, it was a pleasure meeting you." He reached for her hand and kissed it. "Please don't accept any other acting jobs without giving me a chance to make a counter-offer." If she landed another role in her afternoon appointment, that would be disastrous. The setting sun cast its golden hue across the Santa Monica Mountains and showered the city in a honeyed haze. Luckily, the cab she'd gotten into had tinted windows and shielded her from the glare, ricocheting off the Pacific Ocean. Camille looked at her face in the lighted compact mirror. She painted red lipstick on with practiced precision, for all the good it would do. No amount of makeup would make her as appealing as her friend Tasha claimed she needed to be.
"If you want to get the dirt on what he's doing here, you need to entice it out of him,"
Tasha had insisted when Camille objected to the slinky black dress. In case Tasha hadn't noticed, Camille wasn't the enticing sort. Her breasts were too small, her butt was too big, and her legs were too thin. She tugged at the dress self-consciously as the car rolled to a stop in front of the Montage. Even though Tasha had told her not to, she pulled the sheer wrap up over her shoulders, clutching it tight against her chest in hopes of hiding at least one of her flaws. A doorman appeared instantly and helped her out of the taxi. She thanked him and moved indoors. Soren was at Camille's side within a few steps. Damn, this guy was efficient. "Miss Chandler, it's a pleasure to see you again." He walked beside her, his hands clamped loosely behind his back. "Monsieur Delaurent is waiting with a car at the back entrance." Nothing about Soren raised red flags. Still, she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling suffocating her. But that probably had more to do with her reticence than Soren or Julian's potential to be a threat. She followed Soren through the lavish lobby and into a back corridor that, although toned down, still reeked of extravagance. The pair walked in silence. Approaching the exit, Soren stepped a few paces in front of her and held the door open. Julian was waiting outside, leaning against the white limousine. Camille's heartbeat pounded in overtime, pushing those pheromones through her system. This guy was serious eye candy, with jet black ringlets hanging nearly to his shoulders. His hair was a little long for her tastes, but it suited him well, complementing his broad shoulders and masculine frame, as if it, along with each portion of his body, had been hand-picked by the gods. And those aqua eyes, they stood out against his bronze skin like Atlantic jewels. He pushed himself off the car and stepped toward her. Not knowing what to say, she smiled. Julian reached for her hand and brushed it with a kiss. "Chérie, I am honored to have the pleasure of your company for dinner this evening." Is this guy for real? An involuntary snort rumbled up her throat, and she tried to subdue it by holding her breath. No such luck,
Yeah, likewise, I'm sure,
she said, and moved closer to the car. Julian chuckled and waved the driver off before opening the car door himself. With an elaborate hand gesture, he beckoned Camille inside the vehicle. "Sherry, I can assure you my intentions are nothing less than sincere." Sure, it was probably a line, but Camille got the impression it was a line he genuinely meant, even if it was fueled by ulterior motives. Julian de Laurent wanted something, and in a bad way. Otherwise, she doubted he'd be in L.A. looking for an actress on the sly. Her boss, Margot Fontaine, had made it clear it was Camille's job to find out what. The longer he stalled, the more worried she became. What was he up to? She drew a breath, wanting more than anything to enjoy the luxury of the evening. Nights like these didn't come along very often for Camille. But until Julian was ready to reveal his motive, she saw no relaxation in sight. Julian climbed inside the limo and scanned her seductively before scooting up against her. The smell of his aftershave, cool and slightly erotic, and their close proximity, melted her insecurities and prompted her to consider other, more appealing activities. Activities that involved kissing and touching, and... A delicious shudder heated her body, embarrassing Camille. She was too smitten to look at Julian as the car pulled away from the curb. For her own sake, she needed to get hold of the attraction quickly. She wasn't sure what he was looking for, but she had a good idea it wasn't love.
You know, you seem like a really nice guy, Julian.
Camille kept her focus on the red sequined clutch she had borrowed from Tasha and tried to ignore the feel of Julian's silk suit as it caressed temptingly against her bare leg.
If you're not in movies, what can you possibly want with an actress?
Camille wished she could be this inquisitive with her boss, Margot. If she questioned that woman's intentions, she'd be shot down before the words ever settled in the air. But with Julian, it was different. He didn't seem to mind her wariness. Ever the gentleman, always on the verge of courtesy. He paused, his expression softening, his eyes closed and lingered shut for a brief interlude. "Sherry." He looked back at her. "May I tell you about my family?"
"Sure."
His demeanor was young, hip, and fresh, but his words were old-fashioned, shaped in old-world charm. At least the kind of old-world charm she was used to seeing in the movies. If it was truly an act, he was a savant. "My family is deep-rooted in France. I will be honest with you, because if you accept my proposal, you will find out anyway." For the first time, he fidgeted, uncomfortable with his forthcoming information. "The de Laurents are, how do you say tactfully, a very wealthy family." He shrugged as if it meant nothing. "The money is old and the principles are set in the ways of the past."
"How do you mean?"
"Decades ago, hundreds of years even, in noble and elite circles, arranged marriages were, and still are, quite common. They worked well back then, and some Europeans aren't ready to give up their old-fashioned ways."
"Kind of like the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it?"
"Exactly."
"Are you telling me that you suffer from an arranged marriage?"
Julian's eyes lit up. "Of sorts." He exhaled, and his woes seemed to blow out with his excessive breath. "It's more like an arranged engagement that hasn't yet been announced." Could he possibly be after what it sounded like? Was Julian looking for a wife? Camille dismissed that notion. As tempting as it was, it didn't make sense.
"Okay, But I'm not really getting how hiring an actress is going to help you.
My father thinks it's his God-given right to choose a wife for me. His brow drew together in a conflicting frown. I disagree. His demeanor faded into defeat. But you can only push a man like my father so far.
And you're too rich to be poor.
Precisely.
Was Julian trying to pull a fast one on his father?
Camille insisted her brain not go there. It didn't listen.
A man who's already married can't get married.
She laid it out there in the vaguest terms, just in case she was wrong. It's not quite that diabolical. He chuckled. You see, my father feels he also bears a certain sense of responsibility for my happiness, as well as securing a future heir. Whoa, nobody said anything about heirs. He wants a daughter-in-law. Every muscle in his face tightened. It was hard for him to say the words, much less consider making them happen. But I'm not ready for our wife. He paused with a wide-eyed innocence that Camille suspected was a smokescreen. Not a real one, anyway. She shrugged to hide the bit of disappointment behind her growing confusion.
So you think getting an actress to pretend to be your fiancée will fend off your father long enough for him to get over his fascination with you getting married?
No.
Julian shook his head with a calm resolve.
My father can't be placated so easily.
A soft gasp escaped her. You want somebody to actually marry you?
He remained silent, and his mouth curved into an unconscious smile. She'd finally stumbled upon the root of Julian's purpose.
Okay, I'm missing something here.
Her breath caught in her lungs, and she forbade herself to lose her sensibility.
You don't want to get married, so you think it's a good idea to hire an actress to marry you?
She paused, trying not to let her composure falter.
How is that going to fix your problem?
It's temporary, Sherry, he said with a bit of complacency. 6 months, long enough for my father to move on to my younger brother. Then my wife and I can divorce amicably, and I'll be free from the confines of a real marriage.
Why would anyone agree to that?
Julian rested his arm along the back of the seat and wound his hand in her hair. Perhaps $5 million would be an ample inducement. $5 million? Hell yeah! Camille knew a ton of would-be actresses who'd practically kill for a half that. Camille suspected her boss, Margot Fontaine, enjoyed her throne, perched high upon the 18th floor. Who could blame her? A corner office with 2 walls of windows displaying, almost smugly, a commanding view that overlooked downtown Los Angeles. On this day, Margot ignored the scene outside. Instead, her face fell into an exaggerated melancholy as she stared at Camille.
What do you mean you told him no?
Margot's voice shrilled across the desk and withered Camille's self-assurance. Disbelief twisted and knotted in Camille's gut. How could Margot expect her to agree to this charade?
Margot?
Camille's nervous laughter fogged around her like a thick, suffocating vapor.
You really can't expect me to marry some stranger just to get a story.
Margot stiffened and displayed short-tempered impatience.
Of course I don't expect you to actually go through with the marriage.
She heard a heavy dose of sarcasm in Margot's voice.
You can change your mind the day before the ceremony,
she added, as if that was okay. A dense tangle of ideas swarmed inside Camille's head and tightened her muscles with dread. Was Margot serious? She had to be joking. But Margot Fontaine rarely joked about anything, especially assignments.
Margot,
Camille stalled, long enough to find her credible voice.
I can't do that, not even to a stranger.
Julien de Laurent had come across as a little eccentric, and he was most likely a pain in the butt because he was probably used to getting his way, but toying with him just didn't seem right.
Sure you can.
Margot crossed her arms defensively.
And you will.
Stunned surprise yanked Camille back. She shook her head with an air of resignation.
No.
Camille's voice cracked with her failing optimism. She studied Margot's stark face, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as she began to realize the severity of her boss's resolve.
I'm sorry, but I can't do that.
Margot waited, letting the silence linger on the space between them. A tactic to let fear of the unknown build in her enemy.
Camille.
Her tone was calm, a little too calm. That couldn't be good.
How long have you been interning at Disclosure? A year now?
She grabbed a fountain pen and rubbed her thumb along the edge.
Our internships typically last a year. Then I decide whether or not to offer a full-time position, or quite possibly to offer recommendations elsewhere, if I'm so inclined. Margot, I'd love a permanent job with the magazine.
Camille leaned forward and rested her arm on her boss's desk.
But I'd also appreciate a recommendation if that's your decision. Camille, how would you like to come on board with your own column? Oh, that'd be a dream come true. You get me that story, and the column is yours.
Tempting as that was, Camille wasn't prepared to play the game by those rules. She stifled her cynicism and retreated back into her chair.
I'm sorry, I can't.
She dared to raise her gaze and look at Margot.
Is there anything else? Other positions available?
Margot stared at her in a forceful, gritty way.
Camille, your continued employment with Disclosure is contingent upon your accepting this assignment and getting me that story.
Her tone hardened to match her cynical words.
People like de Laurent make me sick. They think they can come over here and buy people at will.
Wasn't that what Margot was trying to do with Camille?
Well, I guess I'll have to decline a position with the magazine then.
Camille wanted to go back to the beginning, before the ad showed up in the LA trades. That was the beginning of the end of her basic belief that her employer abided by the rules of human decency. Julien de Laurent's actions, as far as Camille could see, were no worse than the average super-rich guy who'd gotten himself into a bind and was trying desperately, albeit foolishly, to wriggle out of a disagreeable situation. That didn't mean he deserved to have some reporter disguised as an actress spying on him and his family to write a juicy tell-all. Not that Camille wouldn't mind helping out Julien. She wouldn't mind living the luxurious life for a few months, except she'd probably get too used to it. That'd be her luck. She'd become too attached to the life and Julien's charms. Margot cleared her throat. There was no mercy in her countenance.
That's really unfortunate, she said with a faint bitterness. I guess I was wrong about you.
Wrong?
I thought your career was your top priority.
Her comment was no question.
As opposed to protecting the privacy of someone you don't even know.
Maybe Margot had a point. Why did Camille care about the ramifications for Julien and his family? Why? Because she wasn't raised that way. Granny May had made sure of that. Camille had lived with her grandmother ever since she could remember, after being deserted by both her parents, and Granny May had infused Camille with some old-fashioned values. Values that wouldn't allow her, in good conscience, to do something so underhanded.
I'm sorry, Miss Fontaine, I guess there is a line I'm not comfortable crossing." "That's too bad." "Might I perhaps garner a letter of recommendation?"
Desperation pushed the hopeful inquiry out of her mouth. Camille would have to find another job, and quickly. The bills for the student loans she'd acquired while putting herself through college would soon inundate her. She didn't want to have to compete in a job market that was overcrowded with aspiring actors and actresses. Not that there was anything wrong with waitressing, but that was supposed to be a temporary gig for college students and people like Tasha, who were waiting for that big break. It wasn't meant to be an option for people with college degrees in journalism.
"Recommendation?"
Margot's ridiculing laughter shattered what little esteem she had left.
"Camille, it's all or nothing."
"All or nothing?" Camille's light tone failed to fit the moment. Margot leaned over her desk and propped herself up on folded arms.
"How's your serving skills?"
Serving skills? What the hell was she talking about?
"Well, actresses who can't act, waitress. Reporters who can't report, well, they waitress too."
What? Waitressing? Surely she'd misunderstood Margot's meaning. Camille had graduated from Stanford University with honors. It shouldn't be that hard to land a job with some sort of publication in Southern California.
"I think I'll be able to do better than that. Now, when I'm done, you won't."
Margot pushed herself up and marched around in front of her desk. She leaned against it and folded her arms and crossed her legs, staring down at Camille from behind a mask of artificial sympathy.
"In case you've convinced yourself that I'm nicer than people have tried to warn you in the past year, by the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if you can get a job at a fast food restaurant."
Chapter 2. Bang, bang, bang! Camille Chandler rapped on the hotel room door so hard her knuckles hurt. But damn it, Julien De Laurent owed her. Big time. He'd gotten her fired. Well, sort of. He was definitely the reason she wasn't going from an internship to a permanent position with Disclosure magazine. Granted, that wasn't his intent when he placed his ad in the LA trades. She was just supposed to find out what the mega-wealthy Frenchman was up to. And boy, did she ever. Not in Camille's wildest dreams would she have ever imagined her hard-nosed boss would make such demands. Who knew rejecting a proposal for an arranged marriage was shunning her job duties? She'd missed that memo. A little piece of Camille, the part that found Julien De Laurent as fascinating as he was handsome, had pushed her to his doorstep. But mostly her fear of being homeless, not to mention broke and in debt, was her main motivation for relenting and giving in to his business proposal. She glanced down at the red-fitted skirt and tailored jacket she had snagged off the clearance rack at JCPenney, the best an intern at Disclosure magazine could afford. Should she have worn something sexier? Sexier? Who was she kidding? Sex appeal didn't come easy to Camille, not like her friend Tasha. The most flattering comment Camille had ever received was that she had nice eyes. Not very gratifying when the same guy told Tasha, "God, you're gorgeous." Julien De Laurent must have liked something about her because he had said she was perfect for the part. If he had changed his mind, she was screwed. Just breathe. Her stomach churned with the misgivings of her well-intended but ill-conceived scheme. Maybe this was a mistake. She considered a turn-and-run tactic before someone answered the door. Too late. Soren, De Laurent's shadow, appeared from behind the door. The 2 times she had met with Julien, this guy was with them. It made her wonder. "Miss Chandler, what a pleasant surprise." Soren's stoic expression showered Camille with intimidation. "I'd like to speak with Mr. De Laurent." The words trembled up her throat. right along with the desperation. Please, come in. Soren stepped back, moving aside. I'll let Monsieur Delaurent know you're here. Please, make yourself comfortable. Heading toward a closed door on the other side of the room, he gestured about the suite's living area, decorated with plush couches and chairs and other opulent furnishings that probably cost more than her car. I was comfortable until he waltzed into my life. She stormed to the nearest couch and plopped down. The sofa melded around her like a cloud. Damn. Of course he lived in luxury. God takes care of children and fools. Anybody who'd place an ad in the LA trades looking for an actress to pretend to be his wife for 6 months had to be crazy. Mr. Crazy, a.k.a. the extremely hot Julien de Laurent, as Tasha would call him, entered from an interior room. The suit he wore, custom-tailored and no doubt silk, clung to him and maneuvered with his athletic frame as he moved toward her with laid-back grace. Although a bit on the arrogant side, he was all about making those around him as comfortable as possible. Julian's attentiveness was sexy as hell. His assumption that he knew what was best for everyone was just as exasperating. Camille shot up from the couch, tried to feign indifference, and waited for his lead. Miss Chandler, to what do I owe the pleasure? He asked in a low voice that sounded a lot like how chocolate tasted. Divine. Have you changed your mind, perhaps? His inquiry hadn't come off as a question so much as an insinuation. Was she that obvious? Did she have the words, "I'm desperate," blinking above her in pink and green neon? Camille shifted her shoulders and arched them back. She drew a breath that needed to contain both the confidence and the capability to get her through this nutty scheme. I've been thinking about your offer. Really? He said in a polite but patronizing voice. She had little time to think about his arrogance as he lured her back to the couch with a persuasive, cajoling gesture. I took your rejection of my project proposal yesterday as your final word. Project proposal? God, he made it sound like a damned business venture. Something she had to convince herself of if she wanted to avoid failure. Failure wasn't an option. Neither was stupidity. Let's just say that given a little time, I was able to see some of the hidden benefits of your proposal. Camille paused as a whiff of citrus and light spices danced through the air and played with her senses. The manly aroma, an effective calming agent, had her dreaming about cool, refreshing breezes on warm summer evenings. I'm willing to negotiate. She pushed her anxiety and the temptation aside. Unless you've come to an agreement with someone else. Julian's arm stretched across the back of the couch behind Camille. He didn't touch her, but she had a corporeal reaction to his nearness. It shivered through her like an Arctic chill when he flashed his to-die-for smile. No, the position is yours, if you want it. She sucked in a breath of relief and doused it with logic. We have to set a few ground rules. Such as? Like you can't change your mind once you meet Tasha. Letting him meet her bombshell friend was probably a mistake. Nix that idea. Camille cast her insecurities and attraction to Julian aside in favor of a stereotypical, cold and heartless business persona. Julien de Laurent could not find out about the recent change in her employment status, or that she had a slight thing for him, which she fully intended to conquer. She had no intention of falling for him. Her mother had fallen for her father, and look how that turned out. The man deserted her long before Camille was born. I have some loans that need to be paid off before I leave the U.S. She hoped her monotone voice came across as a shrewd negotiator instead of a desperate fraud. I don't want to ruin my credit, she added, hoping to downplay the loan's significance. Done, he said, without asking how much. That set Camille's worry back in motion. Who would agree to such a thing without knowing the particulars? Our marriage must appear real. The seriousness in his voice drew her focus back to him, just as his lips curled into a goading smirk. Camille couldn't decide if she wanted to smack him or kiss him. You and I will have to share a bedroom wherever we go. She nibbled at his baiting comment, trying not to let it get to her. Wherever we go? My family is very well known in Europe. The media lurks around every corner. You will have to be mindful of every move you make, including those in front of my family. His aloofness siphoned the confidence from her soul, leaving her too spooked to do more than nod. Julian continued like he was relating a P&L statement. Above all others, my family must believe the marriage is real. Was sex part of the bargain? Not that Camille found the thought of sleeping with him out of the question, but she wasn't ready to start trading her favors for money either. You can't buy me. Defiance rumbled through her like a runaway train. Not like that. Cherie, if we make love, it will be your idea. With a wink, he tilted closer, and his devilish grin ignited the allure of temptation. We won't, and I won't. She hoped he bought the resistance. Whatever you say, Cherie. His mischievous smile gave way to roguish laughter. He turned her on. She didn't mind that so much as not being able to control the desire itself. Calling her by the wrong name bruised her ego and earned him a vengeful tone. My name is Camille. I know that, he said, undaunted. Cherie is, how do you Americans say, a term of endearment. I called you darling. Sorry. The bitter tang in her apology stung, but she didn't give him time to exploit her blunder. So, once we're married, as long as I don't leave you or tell anyone the marriage is merely a business contract, at the end of 6 months we'll go our separate ways and I'll get $5 million for my troubles. That is the deal, he said through a half-smile with nothing behind it but teeth. Damn, this guy must be really loaded. What do you want to pretend to be married for anyway? She asked. The reason he gave seemed a little extreme. Why can't you just tell your dad to get off your back? Julian stood. Cherie, you will understand that better after you meet him. He buried his hands in his trouser pockets and towered above her like a hungry vulture, eyeing his cornered prey. I see. The words tumbled from her mouth. But frankly, she didn't see at all. It made no sense. So, do we have a deal? He asked, carefree and smoothly. He slid his hand out of his pocket and volunteered it as a gesture of good faith. There's just one more thing. She evaded his handshake overture. We have to get married before we leave the States. Considering she was born to distrust people, she insisted on a formal guarantee before her feet left American soil. If that makes you feel better, sure. He shrugged, way too calm or foolish. But we have to keep the American marriage under wraps. Why? There will be another more elaborate wedding when we arrive in France. The 6 months will start after that one. Wait! Camille flew up like a bottle rocket and teetered at his side. When will the French wedding take place? She asked. intrigued by the lengths he'd go to in order to pull off his ruse. 2 weeks? A month? His eyebrow quirked as if amused. Apparently he'd seen disapproval in her reaction, rather than intrigue. Displeasure clamped her mouth shut and bulleted her head back. Surely, Cherie, for $5 million, an extra couple of weeks won't matter, Julian said, reading her all wrong. But since he had, maybe she should just go with it. Evidently, it was what he expected, and Camille thought it better to please. You said 6 months. She made it up as she went along. Not 6 months and 2 weeks, or 7 months. Agitation echoed in her voice, unnerved and alarming. It scared even her. She added, for good measure, 6 months. The rant made her question the whole crazy notion more than it solidified her decision to hop on board. What kind of idiot agrees to become some stranger's wife for 6 months anyway? One who's lost her job, thanks to him. One who has a ton of student loans coming due and no way to pay them. One who was afraid of being penniless and forced to live on the streets. That's who. Margot's promise to blackball her on the LA circuit hadn't done a thing to temper that fear. In fact, it magnified it. Whether her ex-boss could do that kind of damage or not was overshadowed by the possibility. And when she added all that to Julian's vulnerable expression when he talked about not wanting to get roped into a loveless marriage, Camille found saying no impossible. That settled it. She was a desperate idiot who was about to agree to marry a hopeless fool. Julian wanted to distract his father, and Camille Chandler was the perfect facade, as well as a most agreeable diversion. Cherie, I can promise you it won't be as bad as you imagine. He'd stopped calling her Cherie, but he liked the way it angered her and brightened her eyes. Feistiness was the one quality she'd need, the spunkier the better, to mount a satisfactory defense against his father and Madeleine. Papa's choice for Julian. Camille would have to be warned. He couldn't risk them blindsiding her, but not until they arrived in France. Acutely aware of his selfishness, Julian decided to wait because he didn't want to begin his search again for a suitable replacement. It wasn't like he was doing Camille a disservice. She'd held her own against him, and she'd hold her own when confronted by his nemesis. He eased back down onto the couch and gestured to the empty space at the other end. She looked at the vacant gap between them, at him, and then back at the sofa again. Her hands nervously smoothed her skirt before she grudgingly sat and folded her hands in her lap. I promise it won't be that bad, he said again, not quite sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. Yeah, so you say. Her tone told him all he needed to know. She didn't trust him. All right. Care to make a little wager? The suggestion was nothing more than a means to ease the tension. Besides, a side bet might be fun. And who knew? If she'd enter into wagers so easily, then perhaps she'd end up in his bed just as effortlessly. She cut her eyes at him. What kind of wager? Of course, it will require that you declare complete honesty. He let the mystery linger a little longer, simply because it aggravated her. How will you know I'm being completely honest? I trust you, Cherie. He held back the snicker, only releasing bits and pieces. She let out a snort and rolled her eyes. Yeah, I'll be as honest as you are sincere. Aren't they the same? She skewed her face into a twisted knot. Can we get back to the point? Ah, good. She wouldn't let his father or Madeleine trick her into disclosing information. The point is that the Pacifique des Lumières is well known throughout Europe. You won't be able to resist his charm and beauty.
Pacifique de Lumière?
She repeated, not nearly as fluently or confidently. It's my family's home near Marseille.
So what do you, live in a castle or something?
She snickered, as if her words were funny.
You know, I hear those things are like cold and damp.
No, Sherry, not a castle. A happy memory from his childhood of his mother chasing him and Andre through the grove paraded through his thoughts. A mild, pleasurable chuckle rippled up his throat. Just a chateau that's been in my family for about 400 years. She sighed and frowned again. Oh, it's been fully renovated and updated with all the latest modern-day amenities. That didn't get her either. Her stoic expression suggested she couldn't care less about his family's home.
Yeah, whatever.
She rolled her eyes, and her voice faded, losing its steely edge.
What's your point?
If you are not entirely mesmerized by the view, if not the chateau itself, I will double your pay. Finally, her jaw dropped.
Are you serious?
Entirely.
And just so we're clear,
she paused, fidgeting in her seat.
What exactly do you get if I am somehow mesmerized?
She covered her mouth and coughed out something that sounded a lot like bullshit. Nothing quite so dark and lurid. He propped his elbow atop the couch and chuckled before taking on a more serious tone. Our 6-month marriage will begin on the day we are wed in France. She reached for his forehead like his mother used to do when he was a child, but Camille's touch was different. It sparked hunger, warm and soft and unfamiliar, and sent it surging through to his core. He grabbed her wrist, a feeble attempt to distract himself from his intense emotions.
I haven't known you for very long,
she said over a half-giggle rippling through the air, but I think there might be something wrong with you. He laughed and laced their fingers together. Camille, you are going to drive my father insane. Her face relaxed into a knowing expression.
I thought so.
She made no move to withdraw her hand. You may not know as much as you think.
You may be surprised.
That'd be a first. He wasn't being terse. Women rarely surprised him. They were an open book, one that could be read from cover to cover in about 5 seconds, but were seldom worth the time. Until now. Every word, action, hint, and suggestion about Camille Chandler held him captive. He hoped he didn't end up disappointed.
Well, that's a pretty cynical outlook for a guy who's got the world at his feet.
The spunk in her tone had returned full force. The world at my feet? He asked, more for amusement's sake than curiosity.
Well, anybody that'll wager $5 million on a bet that can easily be fixed has to have the world at their feet.
She had a point. She could lie. He'd be surprised if she didn't. Money had a way of motivating people to do strange things. His motivation was freedom. Luckily, he had a virtually unlimited supply of cash to support his quirks. But more than that, he got the impression she could use a break. Being me is not all it's cracked up to be.
And why is that?
Enough about me. He leaned toward Camille and looked her over seductively. How he'd like to tangle his hand in those champagne-colored tresses and draw her to him. Are you ready to leave the United States?
Just as soon as we're married.
Oh, that. All right. I'll leave the arrangements to you. It's probably more efficient that way. Julian had no interest in supervising the tedious preparations. The only thing he cared to oversee was the prenuptial agreement.
Vegas.
Vegas? What, she wanted to gamble? Perhaps his instincts had failed him and he'd made a bad choice.
Vegas. It's the quickest, easiest, simplest way to get hitched.
Hitched? Oh, yes, an American idiom. Relief washed over Julian and relaxed his shoulders. Thank God. He'd hate to think he'd lost his edge.
Vegas. That's where we want to go.
Her eyes lit up, like she was enjoying herself. He liked it.
When do you want to go? Today? Tomorrow? I'm not sure when we can get a flight out.
Oh, we can go any time you're ready.
Oh, let me guess. She cut him off. You have your own plane?
That I do, Sherry.
Look.
Her shoulders dropped and she blew out an exasperated sigh.
You've got to stop calling me that.
Why?
I don't know. It just doesn't seem right.
Why?
I'm not really your darling. It's not like we're a real couple or anything.
For the next 6 months, Sherry, we will give every appearance of being just that. And if she succumbed to his charms during that time, so much the better. She was beginning to blush a little, and when she started to fidget, Julian grew anxious. He didn't want her to get antsy and have second thoughts. Would you like to pack a few things or purchase a new wardrobe?
Is that really necessary?
She paused, as if letting the idea of her clothes being inadequate settle into her thoughts.
Well, I guess my J.C. Penney look isn't quite up to par for the De Laurent family, huh?
She opened herself up for a shot at ridicule, a quality only for the brave. She didn't take herself seriously. Another trait Julian could appreciate. Camille. He used her name purposely this time. I think you look great, no matter what you wear. But, as the wife of Julien de Laurent, certain responsibilities and expectations come with the arrangement. The look on her face said she understood. It also said she wouldn't want the job for good.
And being your wife includes dressing the part.
She caught on quickly. Another positive. You'll wear the latest fashions from the finest designers. You'll be draped in jewels that most people can't even imagine. Those who can will envy you. Enjoy it, Sherry. He went back to calling her by the French endearment. She needed to get used to it, because people would expect nothing less from a member of the De Laurent family.
Are you going to make up some fantastical yet completely bogus background for me as well?
Her brittle tone oozed out, and she stiffened with a disinterested, casual lack of concern. Clearly she felt belittled and didn't like it. That wasn't his objective. You are who you are. The story is yours to tell. Julian had to make sure Camille was as comfortable as possible, because soon enough she'd learn about the couple of bulldogs waiting in her near future. It just couldn't be right now. Sure, the story may be mine to tell, but is he going to end up dictating it to me? Even though Camille had her reservations, she intended to go through with his charade. What other choice did she have? Life on the streets in L.A. wasn't pretty, and she didn't want a first-hand look. Marrying Julian wasn't a jail sentence or anything. She'd love to know what it was like to slip into a one-of-a-kind Christian Dior, if only for a little while. And slipping into Julian's arms wasn't a bad idea either. She peered at him, trying to find a reason to back out while sifting through all the advantages of following through at the same time. Money, a haughty husband, who cared if it wasn't real? No worries for 6 months, some potentially great sex, luxuries beyond anything she could envision.
Well, it might be fun to play rich for a little while,
she said, selling herself on the idea. On the contrary, Cherie, you will be rich. Moderately so, anyway. Remember, I am paying you $5 million. Julian did have a point, but Camille had a feeling the degree of wealth she was about to experience was beyond her wildest dreams. A fun prospect, but she was more concerned about ending up homeless and unable to find a job in the field which she had spent tens of thousands of dollars on in educational fees. She just wanted to get on with it and secure her future. And right now, marrying Julien de Laurent for the whole of 6 months seemed appealing for more than one reason. Of course, the option would cruise out the window real quick if he knew why she had changed her mind. No way could she tell him she had lost her job at Disclosure magazine when she refused to accept his proposal and turn the experience into a story. Like he'd really believe that now. The question was, could they get to a wedding chapel in Vegas before he found out she and her employer had parted ways, or worse yet, ran across her bombshell of a friend, Tasha? Chapter 3. Camille hurried close behind Julien as they ascended the stairs up to the aircraft. He paused long enough to grab hold of her hand before entering a private jet that rivaled the size of most commercial airliners. Her stomach churned with the uncertainty of not knowing if she was doing the right thing. Too late now. Her career was already ruined, and Julien owned at least part of that blame. If only he hadn't come to America in search of a temporary wife. Jeez, weren't there any gold diggers in Europe? Did he have to travel halfway around the world to buy himself a temporary wife? Julian's redeeming quality, besides his appeal, was that he seemed like a nice enough guy. Yeah, and they say Ted Bundy was charismatic too. Trusting him had gotten a whole lot of women killed. Good Lord. Camille shook the insecurities out of her head. Julian was no killer, unless you counted kindness and his to-die-for good looks as a weapon. He stopped just inside the cabin and turned to face her with a gorgeous smile curling on his lips. "Make yourself comfortable." He fanned a hand about the cabin. "I must speak with the captain, but I'll return momentarily." Julian disappeared through a door near the plane's entryway, leaving Camille alone with her paranoid insecurities. Just breathe. Camille scanned the cabin. She should take a seat, but she questioned her choice to be there. Did she deserve a $5 million reward for perpetrating a fraud? Probably not, but she didn't deserve to be forced out on her ear either. She had no prospects of employment here in L.A., thanks to Julien, and thousands in overdue student loans that he had agreed to pay off as part of their arrangement. She'd bet the plush couches, even the chairs, were sumptuously comfortable and would lull her into a quick nap. The prospect of an uncertain future in L.A. lured her toward a beige leather chair. Easing down, she felt like she was settling into a cloud. She had never experienced such luxury or comfort, and welcomed it, encouraging it to settle her nerves. Camille opened her eyes and studied the door where Julien had disappeared. She grabbed her purse and dug out her cell phone. Not that there were too many people who'd be looking for her if she came up missing now that she had lost her job, but there was Tasha. She'd make a big fuss. Camille didn't want that. She'd better contact her, but not on her cell. She brought up Tasha's home number and set the call. After a couple of rings, Tasha's seductive voice greeted her caller.
"Hey, it's Tash. If you don't know my cell, then leave me a message and I'll get back to you."
Her flirtatious delivery was overshadowed by her cutting words, pointing out that some callers had limited access.
"Hey, Tash, I tried your cell but got nothing."
The lie came easily, since it was for the greater good.
"Listen, Margot gave me that big promotion I've been waiting for. The catch is I've got to go out of town on a story. I don't know how long I'll be gone, but it'll probably be an extended assignment."
She stopped talking when Soren entered the cabin and approached her. "Miss Chandler, may I get you something to drink during our short flight to Las Vegas?" He paused, resting his hands behind his back. Monsieur de Laurent asked if the Bellagio will be satisfactory until we leave the U.S.
I'll call you later, okay? She said into the phone. Don't worry, everything's cool.
After a bit of brief hesitation, she disconnected the call. After a brief interlude of silence, she turned to Julian's valet.
Soren, is that your first name? She asked,
slipping her phone into her bag. Yes, ma'am. He stood, waiting for her direction.
Can I just get some water or something?
Alcohol and her empty stomach weren't a good match. Of course. He moved to a small bar on the far side of the cabin. And I take it the Bellagio will do? Behind the counter, Soren prepared to serve her request. Not used to having someone wait on her, Camille went to Soren's side. Politely, she slipped the bottled water in the ice-filled glass from his hands and filled it herself.
Sure.
She tried to hide her surprise and anticipation of a visit to the ritzy hotel.
The Bellagio is fine with me.
The glass chilled quickly, frosting her fingers. She hurried back toward her seat and sipped the water before setting the glass on a nearby coffee-like table. Can I get you anything else? She shook her head.
Will Julian be joining me during the flight? I don't really like sitting out here by myself.
Soren's sympathetic smile said he felt sorry for her. I will inform Monsieur de Laurent. He bowed his head and backed out of the cabin. The last couple of days had been long and stressful. Camille's eyelids grew heavy, and she scrutinized her chair and the sofa nearby. She moved to it, wanting to rest for a moment or two. The couch melded around her, lulling her into slumber. Julian exited the cockpit and headed toward the cabin, fully aware of the haughty smirk spreading over his mouth. Camille Chandler, soon to be de Laurent, was a force to be reckoned with. No doubt she could easily handle anything Papa or Madeleine threw at her, but more than that, she had the makings to become a wildcat in bed. Before the marriage was over, he would have her, and it wouldn't happen out of a sense of obligation. Watching her sleeping on the couch, he appraised her with more than mild interest. Her nubile body filled him with an inner excitement. Blonde hair strewn across her delicately carved face beckoned him to her side. Sherry. Gentle fingers swept her hair back. She stumbled out of the sleepy fog, and when her gaze settled on Julian, a hint of pink stained her cheeks. We're about to take off. The seatbelt is a good idea. She sat up and, to his dismay, inched away from him.
Gee, I didn't realize I was so tired.
Camille fumbled for the seatbelt. He placed a hand on her shoulder, hoping to calm her. No worries, Sherry. Once we're in the air, there's a stateroom where you can rest. The color in her cheeks deepened, and a bewildered smile touched her face.
Do you have any food? I'm kind of hungry.
Food? Of course. What would you like?
What do you got?
Soren! Julian lifted his voice slightly. His assistant appeared. Sir? Miss Chandler is hungry. I trust we have something that will meet with her approval once we're in the air. Most of the dinners we have will take longer to prepare than we will be in the air, Soren said. We do have sandwich meals, turkey or ham, I believe. Julian looked at Camille.
Turkey,
she nodded. Excellent. Julian's smile turned on at half power as he leaned back against the sofa. Camille reached for her water glass and glanced at Julian. He stretched his arms along the back of the couch. Will our U.S. wedding take place this evening or tomorrow? With a shrug born in indifference, she waved and said,
How about this evening?
She didn't say anything more until his gaze met hers.
Do you think we can get someone from one of the chapels to come to our suite? instead of going there. I know you want to keep it under wraps."
"If that's what you want, I'll make it happen." He touched her cheek in a wistful gesture. "We'll want to wait until my legal counsel drops by, of course." There was no way they'd be tying any knots before they had signed prenuptial agreements and business contracts. Julian was a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid.
"We can wait until tomorrow if it helps."
Soren came in, and the mild scent of turkey filled the cabin. Julian's stomach ached. Perhaps he should have ordered something. Camille straightened and clasped her hands in her lap. Soren placed a tray with everything she could possibly want on the table before them. She opened the sandwich and tossed aside the lettuce and tomato, painted the bread with a thin layer of mayonnaise, dusted it with salt and pepper, and slapped it back together again. She cut the sandwich in half and grabbed a portion.
"You want the other half?"
she asked, raising the sandwich to her mouth. "You go ahead." Not that Julian wouldn't mind it, but he didn't want to take food from her. He could have Soren bring in another, but his instincts said they'd be landing soon. "I'll get something once we get to the hotel." Her face darkened with rebellion. She dropped her half of the sandwich onto the plate and picked up the other.
"You want some mayo or mustard on this?"
Julian shook his head.
"Look, we can both get something at the hotel," she said. "But for now, we'll just have this to tide us over."
A chuckle ventured up Julian's throat. Trying to resist her was futile. He accepted the sandwich as it was and took a bite. The bread was void of moisture and not appealing taste-wise. "Pretty dry," he said with a wink. They laughed.
"I think room service should be at the top of our list once we're settled into the hotel."
Her infectious grin set the tone for fun. The phone on the table beside Julian rang. He snatched it up before it had the chance to jingle a second time. "Yes?" He listened, and after a brief interlude, hung up the receiver and turned to Camille. "We'll be landing directly," he said. "You have your seatbelt on?" She nodded with a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as if she found his attentiveness both invigorating and irritating. Julian fastened his seatbelt. The puzzle pieces of his future were starting to fall into place. Everything would be fine, so long as Camille didn't go running for the hills once she met Papa and Madeleine. Camille and Julian registered in the Bellagio's executive suite lounge rather than the hotel's front lobby. She had no idea that high-profile guests were accommodated in this privileged manner. There was a lot to learn about Julian's world. After the party checked in, including Soren and Julian's pilot, they rode the private elevators up to the 34th floor to one of the hotel's villas. The 5-bedroom suite's decor captivated Camille with its plush bright red couches and chairs, fine furniture in tan and gold, and topped with black marble. On the far side, a wall of windows draped in red and gold curtains caught her attention and landed on a fireplace smack dab in the middle. Wow! Outside, a terrace boasted immaculately groomed gardens and a private pool. Double wow! Julian grabbed her hand, and she floated along as he pulled her toward one of the rooms. "This will be your bedchamber," he said, opening the door. He knew his way around. He'd been here before. She couldn't imagine paying for this place one night, much less multiple times. Camille stepped inside a room that borrowed its theme from the suite's outer area. Red leather chairs and a matching bed frame were happily situated amid the grandeur of old-world European elegance. The king-size bed, covered in a pink and red floral print, looked inviting. "You look tired, Sherry." Julian brushed Camille's bangs out of her face. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" He leaned against the doorframe, and the smile in his eyes glowed with a sensuous flame. "When Davis gets here, I'll let you know." She exhaled a long sigh of admiration. Julian was respecting her space and not making demands or assumptions. His thoughtfulness was winning him points.
"All right."
She looked down and backed away from him. He turned and closed the door as he left. A cry of relief broke from her lips. Thank God he'd left, before she had the chance to throw herself at him. Julian returned to the suite's living room, and Soren handed him a scotch, straight up. He needed it. He was close, but any minute things could fall apart. Julian was a firm believer in Murphy's Law. If something could go wrong, it would happen to him. He drained the glass, set it on the marble-topped wet bar, and moved toward the wall of windows overlooking the garden and the pool. The Nevada sky was in the midst of a desert twilight, and the terrace lights were beginning to flicker on in a warm, subtle hue. Soren was at his side instantly, handing him a refill. Julian took it and gave his valet a quick nod. "I think it's going to work. You have seen to every detail." "Yes, but sometimes that doesn't help." He shook his head and glanced out the window at the darkening sky and brightening poolside lights. "Things have a way of falling apart easily, but you're quite adept at not letting that happen," Soren reminded him. "You think things through thoroughly. You see every aspect down to the last detail." Soren paused, catching his breath. "I'm sure this will be no exception." "Well, Soren," Julian said, "let's hope you're right." The doorbell rang, grabbing both men's attention. "I'll get it," Julian said, stepping in front of Soren and moving toward the door. Hopefully, it was Davis. Julian hurried across the room and opened the door. Davis greeted Julian with a handshake and a smile they only taught at law school. Julian stepped back and gestured him inside the suite. "I have the paperwork you've requested. It's ready for signatures. Can you get it filed today?" Julian asked, leading him to the wet bar. "Yes, I can get it filed this evening." "Good." Julian gestured to the counter. "You can prepare the papers. I'll get Ms. Chandler." He moved toward the hallway behind the dining area. At Camille's bedroom door, Julian knocked softly and waited for her vocal response. After the second knock, he heard her voice drift through the door. "Yes?" "Cherie, may I come in?" The door opened. Camille was in a bathrobe, her hair wet and clinging to her face. God, she looked sexy. Julian wanted to know what was under the robe. Nothing, he'd guess. He'd sure like to peel it off, discard it onto the floor, and run his hands through her damp tresses before exploring every inch of her naked body. She smiled, tousled her hair with a towel, and gestured him inside. "I decided to take a shower." "The prenuptial agreement is here and waiting for our signatures. If we can sign it now, it can be filed directly, and we are free to wed before leaving tomorrow, if that's still your wish." He didn't know what her wish was, but his was to have his way with her. But that wasn't going to happen tonight. It would take some finesse to woo her into his bed. "That is our deal," she said. "I'll just slip on some clothes and be right out." He wrenched himself away from his ridiculous fixation with her arresting body. His heart thudded a couple of times and then settled back to its natural rhythm. "Of course." He backed out of the room and closed the door. You idiot. Acting like a teenage boy who'd never seen a half-naked girl was not a winning attribute. Julian forced himself back out into the common area where Soren and the attorney were waiting. He smiled and summoned his confidence. "She will be out directly. She's changing clothes. You know how women are." Both Soren and Davis laughed. The attorney offered Julian a fountain pen. "You can sign now, and we'll get her signature when she comes out." Julian stepped forward and took the pen, turning his attention to the papers on the bar. 3 sets. 1 for him, 1 for her, and 1 for the American courts. He picked up a copy and scanned it quickly, but with expertise. Satisfied that it was all there just as he had stipulated, he signed the copies one by one. When he was done, Camille entered the room dressed in a pair of blue jeans and a skin-tight red T-shirt. She walked across the room with sunken shoulders, possibly self-conscious about her breast size, but Julian, being a leg man, was preoccupied with her long, shapely legs. They more than made up for her small breasts. She moved to the bar, scooped up one of the documents, and began reading it. She took her time reviewing each page carefully, and finally, when she reached the end of the last page, she looked at Davis. "So this basically says if we stay married for at least 6 months, I'll get $5 million. "That is what it says in a nutshell." Davis rubbed his nose. "Good." She grabbed a pen and signed the copy she'd been reading. Then she proceeded to compare it to each of the other 2 copies before signing them. Clearly, she didn't trust people, and Julian wondered what made her so suspicious. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that people were always letting her down. People, as a general rule, were unreliable. Julian knew that to be true. It had happened to him. It had happened to his mother, his real mother. She had died, killed herself, when he was 5. His father had remarried shortly thereafter, and it was as if his natural mother had never existed. Claudette, his stepmother, had taken her place, and even though she'd always loved Julian and André just as much as she had loved her own child, Lacey, Julian had never forgotten his real mother. Chapter 4. Bright and vivid sunlight painted the first hues of the day, awakening Camille from her cozy slumber. The lavish bedroom suite at the Bellagio reminded her where she was and of yesterday's events. Considering she'd spent her wedding night alone, her sleep had been surprisingly restful. She forced herself up and out of bed and stumbled into her private bathroom. A quick shower would put things into perspective. Too bad it didn't work. Half an hour in the shower hadn't done anything except give her insecurities time to awaken and fester. She stared at her reflection in the mirror and raked a comb through her damp hair. When was Julian going to wake up and take a long, hard look at her? There was nothing regal about Camille, or refined. She was pretty sure Julian could secure the hand of just about anybody in marriage. Why her? Because it isn't real. She had to keep reminding herself of the conditions that brought about this union. For her own sake, she couldn't get lost in the fairy tale factor that emanated around Julian. Her mother had probably seen it, although to a lesser degree in dear old Dad. Camille was painfully aware of how that turned out, as she had never met her father. Her mother had come around a couple of times when Camille was little, but she never stayed long. She was constantly off on some other adventure, always too busy to take on the task of raising her own child. Camille slipped into a pair of jeans and a loose flowing print blouse. She drew a breath and summoned the courage to face her first day as Mrs. Julian de Laurent. Inside the suite's dining room, her new husband was sitting at the table, all decked out in one of his tailor-made suits. He looked up, smiled when their eyes met, and stood, pulling a chair out for her. "Good morning, chérie." His deep voice filled with amusement. "I trust you slept well?" Smelling the faint citrus scent of his aftershave, she settled into the chair next to him. She propped one foot up and reached for the coffee mug, disappointed by its emptiness. Soren was at her side immediately and filling her cup. "Good morning, Madame de Laurent." She glanced at Julian, who seemed utterly amused, and then let her gaze travel to Soren. A shadow darkened the valet's face, and Camille realized she had frowned at him. She tried to offer an apologetic smile, but wasn't sure it'd come out right. Then she saw him grinning. "Thank you." She reached for the sugar bin. "I asked specifically for some of your Splenda," Julian said. "Well, it isn't my Splenda, but thanks." She stacked a couple of packets together and ripped off their ends. Pouring the contents into her cup, she glanced at Julian. "So, what's on the agenda today? When do we leave here?" "Perhaps this evening." Julian played with his food, dancing the fork around his plate. "The hotel has several boutiques. I thought perhaps you'd like to go shopping." His unquestioning tone reminded Camille of their lifestyle differences. She wore what she could afford, and he wore whatever he wanted. "Oh yeah, the clothes thing." She stirred uneasily in the chair and distracted herself by grabbing a plate. Not that she bought into the notion his money made him better than her, but it was hard to ignore Julian's mega success. It magnified her less-than-spectacular start in life. Camille's fingers tensed around her fork as she stabbed a piece of ham off the serving dish. He looked as if he was weighing the options, but didn't appear the least bit aware about her insecurities. "Be sure to procure a full wardrobe." Camille's gaze froze on Julian, and her fork stalled in midair. "What constitutes a full wardrobe?" What an odd choice of words. It sounded so old-fashioned. Julian hesitated, probably rethinking his choice. Too late. They'd already signed the papers. The deal was done. The marriage had happened. And besides, he owed her. "Would you like Soren to accompany you on your shopping excursion?" "Soren? Well, okay. Maybe." "I guess. Sure." But why wasn't Julian going with her? "Because he's not really your husband, that's why." "But what about you?" She paused, knowing she was probably sticking her nose in where it didn't belong. "Doesn't he take care of things for you?" Julian chuckled. "Yes, he does. And by helping you out today, he will be helping me." "Can't argue with that." Soren grabbed a plate and moved around the table, filling it, and then went to the nearby kitchen counter. Camille didn't understand why he had to eat over there. She didn't like the separation. Julian stood, wiped his hands on his napkin, and dropped it onto the table. "I have some business to attend to before we leave the country. Would you like to meet for lunch downstairs at the Café Bellagio?" She gave a one-shouldered shrug. "Sure." Julian kissed the top of her head and moved toward the door. Money? How was she supposed to pay for the clothes? Julian!" She rested her wrist on the edge of the table and perched her hand in the air. As if he sensed her dilemma, he said, "Soren has all the necessary bank cards." Julian paused, letting his gaze travel to Soren. "Just let her buy whatever she wants." "Of course, sir." Soren spoke without glancing up from his plate. Julian left, and Camille turned her focus on Soren. "Hey, why are you sitting over there?" "It is not my place to eat at the same table as my employer." "I'm not your employer. Come sit with me." "You are my employer's wife." He gave her an exaggerated look of reproach. "Same thing." "Okay. So if I'm like your employer, then I'm telling you to come sit with me." Soren laughed as if sincerely amused. "Nice try." Camille stood, grabbed her plate, and headed to the counter. "If you won't join me, then I'll join you." "Dining with the hired help." He let out one of those ironic laughs. "You're going to fit in nicely at Pacifique des Lumières." "Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm the hired help, too." Soren stopped, and his demeanor turned to stone. "You must never say that again."
It's just a joke.
Not even joking.
He paused, no glimmer of sympathy showing on his face.
No one can ever suspect that this marriage isn't real.
Jeez, Soren, you're one loyal guy. She envied it from Julian's perspective, but felt sorrow from Soren's standpoint. His loyalty seemed unappreciated because he and Julian weren't friends. They had a working relationship and nothing more. Soren felt himself beneath Julian, evident by his own judgment that he didn't deserve to eat at the same table. Camille didn't understand the ways of the wealthy.
It's all part of my job.
Soren nodded and cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the comparison between himself and Julian. Do you ever worry that your efforts will be in vain? She asked, thinking of her own misplaced loyalty in Margot Fontaine.
No.
Soren's head shook in defiance.
Julien de Laurent is an honorable man, and I'm certain he'd never put me in a position that would require me to compromise my values.
Really? That surprised her. So you're okay with this little charade of ours? He paused for a moment, as if thinking it over.
It's not like either of you are hurting anyone. He's not taking advantage of you, and you're not taking advantage of him. You've simply entered into a business deal where both of you are in complete agreement on the details.
That's true.
And in the long run, I do believe this is what is best for Monsieur de Laurent. He would never be happy.
Soren's words trailed off, and a look crossed his face, suggesting he'd said too much. He'd never be happy, Camille repeated Soren's words, turning them into a question. He hesitated, as if guarding a secret. When he finally did speak, it was evasive.
Monsieur de Laurent's freedom is what will make him happy.
How can you be so sure of that?
Because he told me so.
Camille chuckled. Man, I need a friend like you, Soren. If only Tasha listened this effectively.
Does Madame de Laurent have a knack for picking fair-weather friends?
Camille snorted. That's one way to put it.
Perhaps Madame de Laurent is searching for friends in all the wrong places.
Sounds like a country song.
Soren chuckled. I see what Monsieur de Laurent finds so fascinating about you.
He finds me fascinating? Her voice escalated, like those cheerleaders did in high school when they just found out the captain of the football team was into them. Soren looked at her with an absent stare.
Yes, I do believe those were his words. She's simply fascinating.
Camille couldn't fathom why that pleased her, but it did. Soren, she hesitated, and then leaned toward him, touching his arm. How do you feel about going shopping with me?
Oh, I never miss a chance to spend de Laurent money.
He held a stoic face for about 10 seconds and then burst into laughter.
Seriously, I also never miss a chance to see a pretty girl in fine clothing.
His amusement showed on his face.
It will be my pleasure.
Pretty girl, huh? He's definitely been listening to his employer and taking notes. Does Julian have a favorite color? Camille's inquiry touched something inside her. For a wild moment, she wanted to please Julian, and then she wondered why she cared.
I believe it's red.
A smile curled on the tips of his mouth.
A color that will no doubt suit you beautifully.
A blush warmed her cheeks, even though red wasn't anywhere near the top of her favorite color list. She preferred electric blue or a spring green, both colors that brought out her eyes. But she'd make an effort to look like an obliging wife because that was what was expected. She was just trying to meld herself into the part, and nothing more. Camille had given her loyalty to too many people who didn't deserve it. Like her parents, for instance.
Her father had split when he found out her mother was pregnant, and her mother hadn't lasted 3 months after Camille's birth. At 17, a baby was too much trouble. Camille had forever after had a love-hate relationship with her parents, resenting them for not caring enough to stick around, thankful they'd left her in the care of her maternal grandmother. And still she carried them in her heart, waiting for them to prove she wasn't a waste. Those days of misplaced loyalty were over. Julian entered the Bellagio's main lobby and approached the front desk, fiddling with the jewelry box in his pocket. He hoped she liked it. He probably should have gotten her opinion on the rings, but there wasn't time, and he was old-fashioned about that sort of thing. It was his gift to her, not her gift to herself through him. But most women, he'd come to learn, weren't overly picky as long as the rock was big. "Is there a package for me?" he asked the concierge. The lady's polite smile offered confirmation before she answered, "Yes, sir. A messenger dropped it off moments ago." She stepped back and moved toward the cubicles behind her. At the other end of the counter, a stunning, artificial but stunning, young woman was in the midst of an altercation with the clerk. Her blonde hair had been perfectly coiffed. Her dress was nice, but gave the appearance of being more expensive than it really was. Her shapely body was too perfect. She'd spent a lot of money to look the way she did. Definitely not Julian's type. A girl like her would be too high maintenance. Not that he couldn't afford it, but he didn't want a woman who was so centered on vanity that nothing else mattered. No, this girl was more Andre's type. Little brother loved sporting a trophy on his arm.
"Look, I know she's here," the Barbie doll said. "She said she was coming to this hotel specifically." "I'm sorry, miss." The clerk waited for her name. "Ms. Gordon. It's Ms. Gordon." An irritated tone edged her voice. "And I know my friend Camille Chandler is here in this hotel. Somewhere."
What? She's looking for Camille? But why? The concierge handed Julian a large manila envelope. He took it and closed the gap between himself and the girl. "Excuse me, Miss, She gave him one look, smirked, and raised a defying hand.
"Are you hotel security? I'm not going anywhere. I know my friend is in this hotel, somewhere."
"I can assure you that I'm not hotel security." Julian laughed inside. Of course she was a friend of Camille's. Neither of them took shit from anybody. "But I do know where Camille Chandler is."
"You do?"
she said, almost grateful. "I'll just call her," he said, going for his cell phone.
"I already tried to call her."
She inclined her head in defeat.
"She's not answering her phone."
Julian hit the speed dial. "1 second." He waited for Soren to answer the call. "Soren?" the valet answered immediately. Julian thought about asking for Madame de Laurent, but thought better of it. It was probably best to let Camille tell the girl, whoever she was, about their arrangement herself. "Is Camille close by? I need to talk to her." Within seconds, Camille said with a gentle softness, "What's up?" Did Camille have any idea how sensuous her voice sounded? Julian discarded his wandering thoughts and focused on the girl before him. "There's someone here who would like to speak with you."
"Who?"
Her voice was edgy and filled with conjecture. Julian's gaze traveled up to meet the feisty girl's. "Your name?"
"My name?"
Her eyes widened with an impatient glare.
"Give me that damn phone."
She yanked Julian's cell from his hand.
"Camille?"
"Aw, shit."
"Tasha, what are you doing with Julian?"
Camille said quickly over her choking, pounding heart. Soren and Camille exited one of the lobby shops at the Bellagio.
"What am I doing with Julian?"
Tasha asked in a subtle, mocking tone.
"The better question is, what are you doing with Julian?" "We'll talk about that later."
Camille used a tone she knew Tasha would recognize as a discreet warning to keep her mouth shut.
"Where are you?"
She and Soren entered the lobby where she saw Julian and Tasha at the registration desk across the way.
"Never mind, I see you."
She disconnected the call and handed the phone to Soren. Camille had a couple of bags in her hands, and Soren toted the rest. He had protested over her carrying any of them, but she'd insisted. Soren hadn't handled it very well, but she hadn't given him a choice. Now that they'd come face to face with Julian, Soren's posture seemed to crumble right along with his composure. Camille's first stop was Julian rather than Tasha.
"Look,"
she whispered against his ear.
"Don't say anything to him about me carrying the bags, okay? I insisted."
"Sherry, you really should let him do his job." Julian's response was kind but firm.
"He did do his job."
Camille's gaze followed Julian's until she had wrangled it into submission.
"He helped me pick out some great clothes."
She acknowledged the bags in her hands before turning her back on Julian and moving toward Tasha.
"What are you doing here? What's going on, Camille? I called your work and Margot said—"
Camille shushed Tasha, cutting her off. She flashed her friend a look that she hoped was oppressive before turning to face Julian.
"This is Tasha, my best friend. She and I need to talk."
"May I take your bags?" He held out his hands. "Why don't you go into the cafe and have a drink? I'll join you in about half an hour, and we'll all have lunch." Camille gladly gave Julian her shopping bags, happy to get rid of them so she could smooth Tasha's curiosity without giving herself away. Julian looked her over with an inspecting glance. His lips curled into a faint smile as his gaze traveled up to meet hers. "Nice outfit. The color suits you," he said of the red and black designer clothing. She prayed Tasha had kept her mouth shut. Julian moved closer, his intention to kiss her cheek clear. Camille froze. Warm lips brushed against her face and sent chills roving over her body. Julian turned to Tasha. "I look forward to getting to know Camille's friend over lunch." He offered a friendly smile and bowed. Soren dipped his chin and followed Julian. Camille's gaze got stuck on Julian for a moment. A little distance lightened the weight on her shoulders. She drew a breath and turned to her friend. A few wrong words from Tasha, and Camille's plan would be ruined.